back in the old days, 2,000 years ago, they had other laws. You could call them cultural laws. You know, if a man's ox steps on your donkey's tail and the donkey flips over and dies, you know, they had a way of dealing with that. Doesn't really apply today. Just like in the Bible, it doesn't say that you need to go 25 miles an hour in a school zone. That's, you could say, a cultural law that we have today that we need to abide by, but it's not in Scripture. Does? From New Life Ministries, this is Going Deeper with Stephen Arterburn. I'm Stephen Arterburn. And Going Deeper is all about taking the tough issues, the hard issues of life, looking a little bit deeper inside so that we can gain some insight into our lives. Hi there. Thanks for joining me, Steve Arterburn, for Going Deeper. Now, this series on toxic faith, I'm just sticking with it because it covers so many different areas that I think are so important, so many things that get confused in the Christian faith. And boy, today is a big one. We've been looking at some toxic faith beliefs, some things that some less than healthy churches or less than healthy ministers might be teaching folks. And today is toxic faith belief number 13. You could call it biblical exclusivity. And the belief is this: if it's not in the Bible, well, it's not relevant, or it's not to be believed, or it's not trustworthy, something like that. Absolutely ridiculous. In fact, I would say this: it's so ridiculous that there's a corollary that actually is not ridiculous, and that is that if it's in the Bible, it may not be relevant, and it may not be something that you would want to apply to your life. Now, when you hear that, you think, well, okay, he's heretical now. He's saying not everything in the Bible is true. Well, let me just break it down for you. In Scripture, there are moral laws that were true then, and they're absolutely true today. Even though today, liberal or heretical folks would try to say that they don't apply or misinterpret, but that's not true. I mean, it's really clear that when Jesus walked the face of the earth, you know, man, woman, marriage, that's the way it was supposed to be. And adultery was sex outside of marriage. Any kind of sex outside of marriage was wrong. Fornication, if they'd never been married. Adultery, if you are married. So that's really clear. That hasn't changed. But that's a moral law. That's based on God's truth. But back in the old days, 2,000 years ago, they had other laws. You could call them cultural laws. You know, if a man's ox steps on your donkey's tail and the donkey flips over and dies, you know, they had a way of dealing with that. Doesn't really apply today. Just like in the Bible, it doesn't say that you need to go 25 miles an hour in a school zone. That's, you could say, a cultural law that we have today that we need to abide by, but it's not in Scripture. It does say that we need to obey the laws under which we are governed. All right, so then you've got, you could say, religious laws or rules, regulations, and that was, you know, wash your hands before going into the temple, things like that. But those things, those don't apply. What does apply is the moral law. So there are things that aren't in the Bible, but they're okay. I mean, they just make sense. They're not against any particular moral law. Let me give you an example. A lot of times you'll hear people say, well, counseling isn't in the Bible. They don't have therapists and counselors in the Bible, so yeah, you don't need a counselor. Well, that's a sad thing. You know, I've heard people say, look, Paul didn't have a therapist. Well, you know, he also, I don't think, had a dentist. That doesn't mean it wouldn't have helped him. But think about this. Paul said, this is the big guy of the New Testament. Paul said, the very thing I want to do, I can't do it. And the very thing I know I shouldn't do, well, that's exactly what I do. Sounds like to me, if he had a counselor or something like that, that maybe he could have figured that out. He was such a great man of faith. And when I read about him and his struggle like that, it gives me great hope. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't Jesus. He was Paul. But here's the thing. Just saying that somebody didn't have a counselor, it's not in the Bible, doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. Well, the fact is, years ago, there weren't many Christian counselors around. And so people heard things that Freud said, religion is the opiate of the people. I think that was Freud. Anyway, but they thought everything that was in counseling was bad because it was related to somebody that wasn't a believer. Well, since then, we have seminaries, we have Bible colleges, universities that are producing thousands of very committed Christians first, who aren't called to go preach or aren't called to be a missionary, but they feel like they're called to be a good source of counsel to somebody else. So they study counseling to do it better. So in my own life, I remember going to a PhD who was a Christian because I was recommended that I go to him by a minister. And it really opened up a whole new world for me. I've been involved in counseling and out of counseling ever since. I go see a counselor every week. So a lot of great, wonderful counselors can help you with something that might be a stronghold or some area of addiction or whatever it is, a hurt from the past that's impacting your present. But I got to tell you this, there are a lot of secular counselors. If you go to them, they're going to honor your faith. Now, I don't know how to figure out who they are except by reputation, but I'm just saying counseling is not an evil thing. And it's so wonderful when we're blind to something, when we really have something that's kind of glaring to everybody else and we don't see it, that somebody can help us see it and then know how to deal with it. I think that's one of the most fantastic things ever. Even more damaging to some folks is this belief that all psychotropic medication or medication in general from psychology or psychiatry is evil. Well, I got to tell you, just as people are born diabetic or they develop that and they need a certain procedure that's not in the Bible, there are people, their pancreas, their kidneys, their liver, that's not off. But their brain chemistry is off, or you could say their brain wiring is off. And a medication can fix that. I've known people that had extreme anxiety from the very beginning of their lives, and then they find this one medication, and all of a sudden they're functioning normally. In this day and age, many times a person that is schizophrenic, that person years ago would be probably spending all the rest of their life in a state mental hospital. But today, because the medications have gotten so good and effective, many times they can live a life that's even easier, or you could say more normal, than folks that struggle with less severe problems. One of the unique stories in the Bible is where Jesus heals a blind man. Now, he could heal this blind man by just saying, "You're healed." But he does this interesting thing of spitting on the ground, making some mud, putting it on the guy's eyes, and then he goes and washes, and then he can see. Now for me, I got to tell you, I just kind of think that's a great story because he's using an external substance to put on something, and I just think it might be a little message to us that it's not all about what's in here. But sometimes we need to apply a medication. Sometimes we need to take a medication for things to be okay. Now let me tell you this. This is the most damaging thing. Any preacher that's saying you should not go to a Christian counselor, they're making a judgment, really a blanket judgment that every person who is a counselor today, no matter if they went to the most conservative college or seminary, that they're doing something anti-Christian, that they aren't normal or healthy in their faith, that they've been deceived. I tell you, I'm not prepared to do that about anybody, make that judgment, but they do. So I just want to say that there are things in Scripture that we're not abiding by those cultural laws, and there are things that aren't in Scripture that are absolutely necessary for some people to live. And if they don't, they might take their own life, they might take somebody else's life, but there are a whole bunch of folks that if they don't get the right kind of support and counsel from somebody really trained in this, they're going to spend a needless life with guilt, shame, remorse, depression, severe anxiety, anger, bitterness. All of those things, we can come to find the source of it, deal with it, and experience a better life once it's been processed and dealt with. That's what I want to see happen. So, biblical exclusivity. Well, I'll tell you this. The truth of the Bible, it is an amazing, powerful thing to have inside your heart, your mind, and to live by that truth. But don't think that everything you can or cannot do is going to be right there in black and white. It's actually kind of silly to think that. I'll see you next time. Thank you for joining me for Going Deeper. I hope something I've said may have helped just a little bit. If you have a question you'd like me to answer or comment, just email me at stevesocial@newlife.com. I'll see you next time.
If you want to support Going Deeper with Stephen Arterburn, be sure to subscribe so you never miss another episode. And if you know someone who would benefit from this episode, be sure to share it with them. See you on the next Going Deeper with Stephen Arterburn from New Life Ministries.